this to me is like the really fascinating material.
We don't know what the answer is, but we're looking for patterns.
I think we're looking at kind of a type of cosmic alchemy.
The story slowly differs.
But still, a lot of people don't know that this technology actually exists.
The possibilities here are pretty mind-boggling.
We can't just believe that it was the work of these lone, troubled individuals.
Like a conspiracy theorist would look at that and say, well, the Illuminati or somebody planned this right
Now,
away
is that
in advance.
or is that by design?
Looking for meaningful coincidences.
The same pattern.
You're interfacing with your neural circuitry. They're mapping your electromagnetic field and interface it onto an artificial intelligence array system with a live handler in real time.
For someone who's paying attention, they can connect the
It's like
dots.
being drugged, but you're not on drugs.
An effort to do everything they could to discredit this idea.
But it's one thing to read about these things, it's another thing to actually meet as good as you Public Enemy fan, Nick?
No, I mainly like punk music.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, I saw that Johnny Rotten was wearing a Make America Great Again shirt.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Huh?
Do you remember that from a couple weeks ago?
No, I don't actually. No.
Yeah, he was John Lydon. He was out there somewhere, like in California or something, and he was wearing a Make America Great Again t-shirt, and somebody took a picture of him leaning out of a window.
Created quite the controversy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll bet it did.
I thought that was interesting as kind of like anti-establishment as he is, but I guess he's trying to like kind of troll people, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe.
So, we're gonna talk about the Paranormal Parasites book.
Okay.
This is which book number is this? Have you counted?
Well, that was like about 48, I think, and then early next year it'll be sort of around about 50, I think.
Oh, okay.
I've kind of lost track as well. As being the author, I just I'm not sure myself.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting stories in this one. This is kind of a.
Well, yeah, I mean it was a story really that when you are we started or not?
Oh yeah, we're started.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that when you're sort of writing a book or planning on a book, you want to be able to give the reader something new, and as well as being a writer of books, I'm a reader of books as well. So, I sort of appreciate hopefully what readers want, which is something new. And so, over the years, I'd sort of collected a number of stories that sort of fell into this sort of paranormal parasite category. And over the time, the numbers got up more. So I thought, well, why not do a whole book on it, covering all the various different types of entities and creatures, and demonstrate this sort of, I guess, undercovered area, the paranormal. A lot of people perhaps, weren't even aware of this angle of it all.
Yeah, that's it's something that I've been interested in for a while, just that whole concept of how these entities can feed off of people.
Yeah.
Basically. This is something that, you talk about this, actually, I think the first book that I can think of that I've read by you that I can think of is we've talked about on the show is Final Events. And there's a lot of this in that, actually.
Yeah, you're right, there is. And, you can actually find a lot of cases of, when people have encounters with paranormal creatures, entities, whatever you want to term them. You do often find there's sort of this negative angle, when there's this sort of confrontation or encounters where people do fall sick. They get ill, and there's sort of runs of bad luck and, just disasters, as if sort of like a dark cloud has come over them, but in the same way, it's sort of physically affected them as well.
Yeah. So let's kind of like the broad, or like the definition of a paranormal parasite, like what that means.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, although I sort of cover a lot of different things in the book, like the black-eyed children, the shadow people, men in black, women in black, the list goes on, the actual sort of encounters aren't really that different. It's just the entities that are different. Now, what typically happens is that usually a lot of these encounters occur in sort of like the dead of night, sort of 1, 2, 3 a.m., that kind of time. And people see these sort of paranormal creatures in the bedroom very often. And the person or the victim, however you want to term them, suddenly starts to feel sort of weak and lacking in energy and just feel kind of really ill, as if their life force is being drained from them. And this is something I've received in stories time and time again, where people, they're in this high state of fear and anxiety, and adrenaline's pumping around the body, and it's almost as if these entities deliberately try and get the person into that state of terror and fear, and then they, in essence, feed on it. They quite literally sort of feed on it, to where people have felt as if these creatures were, at the time of seeing them, it was like, their life force was being sucked out of them. And that the feeling, in some cases, goes on for days and days. The people feel as if they got the worst dose of the flu, where they can't barely get from the couch to the kitchen or whatever. So that's sort of the overall angle, if you like, that the book takes, that these things may actually sort of use us in a very strange way, but as almost as a food source, if you look at it like that.
Yeah, they elicit the fear response, and in that
yeah,
way
and I think that's
feed
part
on it.
of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you see kind of on the obverse of that, though? Are there any that kind of maybe elicit like a positive response from people and feed off of that, like a positive energy? Have you encountered that?
Well, I guess the closest I can think of is where people have had, they encountered, again, paranormal entities, but where the response has been positive, where the person has sort of had this sort of feeling, sort of literally in seconds, that they need to sort of change their life and go down a different pathway. And, in many respects, their lives have been changed for the better. Now, it's not a case of, sort of instilling them with some sort of energy boost or anything like that, like the opposite of the paranormal parasites. But there are a lot of cases where people claim to have had encounters with aliens, abduction stories, things like that, where overnight they've changed their style of living. They've sort of gone on a more less on sort of just rather than being me, they were sort of felt driven to sort of help other people, and things like this. So, and in those sort of cases, it is very much like a positive experience where they feel transformed, but that doesn't sort of relate to, the exact opposite of what we're talking about. It's not like they're sort of injected with, sort of positive energy. It's more the thought is put in the mind that, you need to do this or do that.
Yeah, the whole parasite, I mean, that word has a negative connotation anyway.
Yeah, you're right, it does. And I mean, even the word itself, kind of conjures up like some sort of, sort of creature just sort of latching onto you and sucking you dry,
Yes, sucking your life force out of you, basically. Yeah. So this energy that you kind of speculate in this book, what that could be, like what kind of energy that these entities could be feeding off of us.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look out through numerous cultures around the world, going back not just centuries but thousands of years, many of these cultures believe that there are these sort of natural energies, if you like, within the human body, which can be sort of utilized in different ways, and in terms of how we sort of use these energies, possibly not even, having awareness of what they really are. But I mean, for example, yoga, people who sort of study yoga, I mean, they talk a lot about prana, which is sort of to be this sort of, almost like a supernatural energy itself, which the human body sort of requires for sort of the human mind and the human consciousness to work properly. And they basically, the idea is that different energy sources can, in different ways, sort of aid, the skin, the organs of the body, the mental health, and things like this. In other words, it's more along the lines of sort of your mindset being in the right way to apply these different energies, like, for example, prana, and there's another one called apana, which, again, if you look into the ancient stories and legends of ancient civilizations, they all had these kind of similar beliefs that the body itself wasn't just all there was. It weren't just sort of flesh, bone, blood, skin, etc. Now, for example, in Hinduism, they have a tradition of what's called samana, and that is supposedly if your samana energy levels are high, that means basically you're very, very kind of healthy, you're eating the right foods. A lack of samana and eating sort of fast food, junk food, caffeine, things like that, lower your samana levels. And so, I mean, you can look at it two ways. Yes, these energies are real, or, by living sort of a healthy lifestyle and following the belief systems, you could still, have sort of healthy life. So, when you look at it, though, one of the intriguing things is that, whether it's like South American tribes, Native Americans, India, Pakistan, China, Japan, they all, regardless of the different names, they all come down to different energies that reportedly feed different parts of the human body and the mind. And if those energies are depleted, or in the cases of like paranormal parasites, if they're depleted deliberately, then you start to get sick. I mean, you can look at things from the very down-to-earth explanations, like, for example, you have a young girl, for example, who's got bulimia, and ends up with anemia because her body's just depleted of food, But for the ancients, there was more to it than that. It was a case of sort of balancing the body with these supernatural energies, and not, sort of ending up in the gutter, so to speak.
Yeah, and you also talk about orgone energy too, which I thought was pretty interesting. Kind of the likening it to these ideas of like prana, like this sexual energy.
Yeah, well, the whole issue with orgone energy really goes back to Dr. Wilhelm Reich, and he was someone who, very controversial guy and well ahead of his time, and died young in the 1950s. But he was someone who came to believe and realized that there were these different kinds of energies sort of flowing around the human body. And although he sort of looked into a lot of different areas and angles, the one that sort of really drew him in was what he called orgone energy. And it was basically the idea of utilizing sort of sexual energy in a positive fashion. I mean, you see some countries where, sexuality is sort of frowned upon, and, a lot of draconian rules and laws and that kind of thing. And Wright came to believe that, if you were sort of had a positive mindset, you didn't have hang-ups and things like this, that all of this could actually have a a bearing upon this so-called orgone energy. And the more that he sort of dug into this, the more that he found having this sort of positive approach to sex and being, closed-minded and et cetera, he came to believe, or conclude, I should say, that the stronger the levels of orgone energy, the more healthy a person would be. And he wrote a number of books on this particular subject, and made an interesting case for the possibility that, a relaxed mind, an open mind, et cetera, actually has a major bearing on the body as well. And so, but of course, one of the problems was that, he came up with his own sort of medicines and treatments and so on, which weren't as far as the FDA was concerned, they frowned on it because, it wasn't sort of, legal or certainly, stamped things that he was selling and so on. And he ended up in jail as a result of peddling, as they saw it, cocktail substances which they looked down on, and he died in prison.
Snake oil. They would have called it snake oil, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of a snake oil situation where, he was sort of, placed in a situation in jail where, all his books were burned, and he kind of just almost gave up. It was like he just couldn't take what was being dished out to him. But I mean, if you look at his work and the results and the people who he worked with, and the volunteers who helped, they were all concluded, that this positive energy could literally kind of have a majorly substantial effect on people's health. But of course, with a lot of people who sort of look down at alternative health systems with like a frown, they look at it as, well, what actually is this? That's where basically Reich had his, how he came to fall, because it was people sort of perceiving him as you said, like a snake oil guy.
Yeah, he got in trouble with the FDA, I think, right? Wasn't
yes,
that
he did,
happened?
and he was. But what he was basically doing, he was transporting these technologies and items, that he was selling, and he was selling them like across the borders.
Orgone accumulators and stuff like that.
Yeah, orgone accumulators, and what he was doing, he was selling them, going over from state by state, which was illegal, and he was actually sort of snared in a trap where somebody wanted to buy one in a different state, and it actually turned out to be a government official.
Orgone accumulator sting, man.
Exactly. And what happened was, he was pulled into sort of this trap, and then charges were brought against him, went to jail, and had a heart attack in jail and died there as well. And as I said, the most outrageous aspect of all, his books, his own books that he's written. Bear in mind, this was only the 50s. We're not talking 200 years ago. His books were all burned, which is pretty incredible when you think of it like that.
Do you think he was on to something, Nick? Do you think that I know he's a very controversial figure, but do you think he was probably on to some reality?
Personally, I actually do. I think he was onto something. I don't think he had all the answers by the time, that he was dead for sure. But I mean, I do think that he was onto something, particularly in relation to how people who, had sort of ailments and illnesses throughout their lives, whether psychological or physical, that by using, for example, like the organ accumulator, et cetera, it was, in essence, he was perceiving it, that he was having a solid, sort of effect upon these people, even if he didn't at the early stages, sort of really, sort of take off in the way that they actually did. But I mean, the more that he looked into this, the more he sort of created different terms for some of these energies. One of them were called bions, and they were said to be sort of like small sacks of energy that could kind of morph into one-celled entities. And he said there were two kinds of bions, the reds and the blues. And he said they were sort of, as he saw it at least under the microscope, it was almost as like two competing viruses, you know, one trying to beat the other. But they were actually sort of cells, if you like, that would actually sort of rejuvenate the human body. And so he was going down some really controversial areas, and certainly some of it, you know, was based on his own words and theories, you know, and so the extent to which, you know, had he survived and had his work not been sort of clamped down, who knows, you know, where we could be. But he came to believe, you know, that orgone could basically sort of cure cancer and psychological conditions, sexual anxieties, neuroses, and much more. In other words, it would have a primary effect on the mind, but then that when the mind starts to repair itself, the body does as well. You know, it's kind of like in the regular world, if you have someone who has, say, panic attacks, you know, their mind is in a total state of panic, but living in a state of total panic and stress will also have a physical effect on your body as well, like your blood pressure, ulcers, things like that.
Right.
So in that sense, you know, the mind itself really can be very destructive to the body, you know.
And an effect on the environment too. Like we have an effect on our environment.
Something that really interested me that you kind of put together for me there was, I'm real casual with Reich. I haven't studied a whole lot. I've just mostly, especially haven't read his writings, just read about him secondhand. But it's usually presented like he was into this orgone stuff, and then he was also really into sexual liberation. And it's like the secondary thing. But now that you're kind of like putting it together for me, he was actually, I'm sure they were like tied in some kind of, especially influenced by the Eastern Kundalini kind of stuff. And
yes, he was, yeah. Sort of like today, you know, things like tantric sex, you know, he was someone who sort of encouraged, you know, open sex, and you know, he was also someone who felt that it wasn't important that you've got to be married at 25 and have kids at 30 or whatever. You know, he felt that being pushed into that sort of category, you know, that you know, birth, school, work, death kind of thing. You know, he was someone who felt that society had sort of placed these almost restrictions on us of what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to live, you know, and as I said, he had a very open approach to things, you know, for example, like swinging, you know, and having open relationships, and, you know, whatever sexual preferences you had, you know, provided you weren't hurting anyone, etc., that you should follow it. And he felt that the pressure to be, quote, normal, so to speak, was not the way to live. It was almost like we're living in chains because we're forced to do that, you know.
It makes you wonder what, you know, if he had lived and seen the 60s, how, you know, people
well,
would have broadly...
the irony is, had he lived into the 60s, I think would have been championed as almost like as a guru for all, you know, for sexual like liberation, you know.
Yeah, kind of like Timothy Leary or some of the other kind of people.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the orgone, the energy is interesting, and being sexual energy is interesting because you talk about something I had never even heard of before, which is lovers' lane beasts. But it's interesting, Nick, because as I was reading your book, we had a local guy here in Nashville named Chad Coleman. He started talking about on the show that we did with him about people seeing weird creatures at lovers' lanes. And I thought I was like, wow, that's a synchronicity.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't know about this, but you can, you know, if you Google like paranormal plus lovers' lane, you know, you'll find a lot of really interesting stories. Now, most places around the world, have like a lover's lane type place where where people go on a Saturday night. I think that they do it less today than they did in sort of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and so on.
Yeah.
But you can find them all over the place. And where I grew up as a kid in England, there was one like about 2 miles away, and it was like a large hill. And there were no lights up there, but there was winding roads and a big car park. And of course, everybody does what everybody does, And but what's interesting is that in a lot of cases where people have seen strange entities, supernatural beings, monsters, whether it's Bigfoot-type creatures, Mothman, the stories of Goatman and things like this, all around the world, when people have been at sort of like a lover's lane location, making out, having sex, then suddenly these creatures appear out of nowhere, and it's, somebody's in the, couple in the car, and then suddenly they see this shadow in front of the hood, and there's this sort of 7 to 8 foot tall Bigfoot type creature. Or, for example, just about everybody's probably heard of the Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which was first seen in 1966 in this little town of little city, I should say, Point Pleasant. Now, the original witnesses were actually out at a closed-down TNT plant, the military, which is very sort of dark and desolate and surrounded by trees, etc. And the first witnesses to the Mothman in Point Pleasant were out at one of these lovers' lanes locations. So one of the things I talk about in the book is how it's clearly way too convenient for bunches of people out at these lovers' lane locations, and then suddenly these strange creatures pop up. There's no way it can just be coincidence all around the world. And so for that reason, I think these entities kind of turn up or somehow they're able to target in on high states of sexual energy, the same kind of thing that Reich was looking at. But these beings, these creatures, seem to have a much stronger hold on all this, and it's almost like radar. They home in on this high state of sexual energy, and then possibly feed on that as well. It's almost like the analogy of pulling up at the gas station and fueling up your truck. Because you know where the gas station is. It's kind of like that the sexual energy is so strong, these things can pick up on it and then drain us of it.
I guess it makes sense. It's like in biology, almost every single thing will have something else come along and feed on it. So if there are spiritual realms or these weird intersections of spiritual and physical realms, like some kind of energy that's tied to consciousness or something, then why wouldn't there be an ecosystem there? And
Well, yeah, I mean that's how nature works. Something comes along and eats something, and then it gets eaten. And the food chain is what keeps everybody going. Whether you're an animal, a person, a vegetarian, a meat eater, everybody has to have something to survive and live. Whether, like I said, you're a meat eater, you're a vegetarian, you're a vegan, or whatever. You cannot live without eating something. Nothing can, basically. And, depending on where you are on the food chain, you've got a better chance of surviving or not. And I think with us, we don't really give much thought to the idea that we could be the prey. We can see,
Right.
we see us as like the predator. There's nothing better than us, that kind of approach, which is sort of like a typical egotistical thing. But if you think about it, there are a lot of animals on the planet that we really would not stand a chance against. You go into a lion's den, it's like, well, good luck getting out of it. You'll get torn apart. There's a lot of animals which are far stronger than us and which we physically cannot compete with. But, I guess with our technology, we can find a way, to avoid that from happening. other animals are unable to, come up with technologies to prevent themselves from being attacked. But we don't think of ourselves as, as something to be put on the plate. We look at it as we're the ones who are filling the plate.
Yeah, we're top of the food chain. One of these,
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say we may not be, if but it's
right.
With us, we realise it because we're not being physically fed on. And I think for a lot of people who have these experiences and they feel wiped out the next day, probably a lot of them don't think, oh, I've just been paranormally digested. They just think that was a horrible nightmare and it kept me awake and stressed me out, and that's why I'm tired. So a lot of people, I think, don't realise this phenomenon is actually going on and don't realise it for what it really is.
The Goatman. That was one of the Lover's Lane beasts that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Plenty of symbolism
enough,
there.
What's that?
Plenty of symbolism there.
Well, yeah, because, the Goatman sort of goes way back to sort of like ancient Greek folklore, with the satyrs, as they were called, which were these, like humanoid figures, but with like goat-like attributes, sort of like hoofs, and horns. And they, for example, were sort of like highly sexual animals. And what's interesting is that there are a number of Goatman stories where people have seen things like the ancient Greek satyrs in various parts of the United States at Lover's Lane locations. Ironically, coincidentally, where I live, just outside Dallas, about a 30-minute drive from me, maybe a little bit less than that, there's a little town called Lake Worth. And they have a legend of a Goatman going back to the 60s, where this strange creature was seen rampaging around the woods, and it became known as the Goatman for obvious reasons, how it looked. But the first witnesses were out at Lake Worth is the name of the town, but there's also the lake in Lake Worth is also called Lake Worth, so it's a bit confusing. But back then, today it's like a wildlife area you can drive around in, but the government owns it. Back then, kids were just driving around, at night and having a good time. And it was back in the 60s, actually 69. Next year will be the 50th anniversary. That they started to see this sort of Goatman satire type creature when they were sort of making out in the cars. So, this is another example, not just of entities sort of feeding on, people in these Lover's Lane locations, but also a tie-in that goes right back with the satires and Greek mythology and sort of the sexual angle of these creatures as well.
Isn't there a Lake Worth monster too? Isn't there?
Well, actually, it's the same. It's the same thing. Some people call it the Goat, because that's how it looks. But other people call it the Lake Worth monster. But it's actually, it's kind of like Bigfoot and Sasquatch. It's the same. It's two names for one thing. But some people, as I said, called it the Goatman because that's how it looked. But because of the location, others called it the Lake Worth monster. And funnily enough, or coincidentally enough, the first person who ever actually wrote an article about the Lake Worth Goatman was the conspiracy researcher Jim Mars, who died last year. And
really?
He was the first one. Yeah, he used to work for the Fort Worth Journal, I think the newspaper was, and he was the first one to write a newspaper story on the Lake Worth Goatman.
The Black-Eyed Children. This is one we talked this was way back when we first started. We talked to David Weatherly about this because he had the book out at the time. Yeah. And you talk about this as being another one of these creatures that drains energy. I know we've also talked about this a little bit with you, kind of like about the Men in Black as well. So, what's your thoughts on this old Black-Eyed Children thing? Is there your research, is there something to it?
Oh yeah, David's a good friend of mine, and we sort of hang out like 2 or 3, 4 times a year at conferences and things like that. And David, when David told me he was writing this book on the Black-Eyed Children, he asked me if I would be willing to, write the introduction for it. And I knew that David had sort of got a lot of data, and he's a very good researcher. So I thought, well, yeah, sure, I'll be happy to do the introduction. And but it was only when I started reading the book that I realized the sort of sheer scale of reports that David had been able to put together all across the country, you know, and it was clear that there was some sort of phenomenon was developing and very quickly that sort of took off in the late 90s with a journalist in Abilene, Texas named Brian Bethel, who had his own sort of creepy encounter with two black-eyed kids late at night. The story was put on the internet, and then it kind of took off from there, you know, so it's been around roughly about 20 years, but it's definitely picked up more, you know, interest in certainly in the last 5, 7, 8 years, 10 years, thereabouts. And the black-eyed children, for people who don't know, they're called the black-eyed children because when people see these weird-looking kids, the entire eye is totally black, not just the middle part, I mean, but the entire eye is black. And they very often wear these sort of dark hoodies, which they sort of pull down right towards their eyebrows, and when they're talking to people, they sort of look at the floor, so you can barely get to see them properly. And typically, what they do, they'll knock on the door late at night, and of course, like most people, you know, if there's a loud knock on the door at 9 o'clock, you think, who on earth's that, you know?
Yeah.
And so, you know, you just look through the security, the spy hole, you know, on the door, and you see these two kids there, and people always get this weird vibe from them. They don't want to open the door, you know. All they see is these kids with sort of skin that's like the color of a sheet of paper, you know, like white, like as if they're sort of deathly ill. And then they catch a look at those black eyes, and they definitely don't want to let them in then. But there's some in most cases, they don't get in the house. What they typically try and do, they try and get to the person inside to invite them in, which kind of sounds like the old vampire parallels and legends, you know, where the vampire can't enter the home until you invite them in. They often say things like, we're homeless, we're hungry, can we come in? Or will you let us in? Or, you know, we need to phone our parents, we're lost, that kind of thing.
We want to read. That was another one.
Yeah.
Can you let us in? We'd like to read.
Yeah. And they're always, you know, the things they say always kind of sound a little bit odd as well. And as if it's almost like it's scripted, you know, rather than just spontaneous talking. In most of the cases, although the witnesses usually do get to see them, whether they open the door, you know, and just leave the chain on, whether, you know, they see the eyes, they see the face, and they get terrified and shut the door. That's what happens in most cases. But there are a few where it was as if the black-eyed kids have been able to sort of mind control or hypnotize the person into opening the door. And in 3 or 4 cases that I've got where the black-eyed kids actually did manage it to get in the house, the witnesses said it was almost immediately as if they were kind of like somebody had just hit them with like anesthetic, you know, or they were coming round from surgery, that kind of thing. And everything kind of seemed a little bit spaced out and they weren't sure what was going on. It was slightly, almost like being in like a Matrix kind of world, you know, that it looked like the real world, but it wasn't, that kind of thing. But in those cases, those few cases I've got, all of the witnesses said that as soon as the black-eyed children were in the house with them, they started to suddenly feel really weak and ill and sick and like their energies would drop in. And one witness sort of described this kind of phenomenon as like how a diabetic might feel, you know, if they miss breakfast and lunch and then it's 9 o'clock at night and they start to get the shakes, that kind of thing, you know, they've just got to eat something. And so that's how it comes across. As soon as they're in the house, it's like they're literally feeding on the person. But in a bizarre way, it's almost as if there are certain rules that they have to abide by before they can actually go through this process, you know, which is sort of really, really weird and strange.
It is weird and strange. And you've drawn the parallel yourself to like the Men in Black phenomenon. Like it's almost like an updated version of it.
Well, actually it is. I mean, that's a good point because when people think of the Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, because the movies were so successful. But even people who weren't interested in ufology went to see the movies. And, most people, you could ask them, even people aren't interested in UFOs. You say, who are the Men in Black? They'll say, oh, those are those guys who shut down UFO investigations or whatever. Most people know that. But the Hollywood version is actually very, very different to what people describe in the real world. Now, most of the people who've been visited by the Men in Black, again, they sort of usually come late at night, dressed in black suits, skinny black ties, white shirt, and sort of old 1950s gangster style fedora hats. And very often, even at night, wearing black wraparound sunglasses. And people have said that their skin, like the black-eyed children, is literally sort of white, and their skin kind of looks like plastic. There's no lines, creases, almost like a mannequin kind of situation. And so they don't really kind of look human. Very skinny, tall sometimes, like 7 feet, and they, like the black-eyed children, it's almost when they threaten people and warn them not to talk about this or that, it's almost like it's scripted, as it is for the black-eyed children, like as if they're programmed somehow to say this. But they too, people have reported how that when the Men in Black were sort of threatening them or staring at them in the living room, they too started to feel weak and ill and dizzy and, as if they were going to pass out. And these feelings sort of went on for days after, the Men in Black had left. So, we're dealing with something that clearly has some similarities to the black-eyed children phenomenon, except, they appear as adults and the others appear as children. But the actual scenario that plays out isn't really that much different. Now, one of the important things to note about the Men in Black stories is that they threaten people, and of course that threat creates fear in the person. So I think sometimes, if not always, when they threaten people not to talk about what they've seen in terms of UFOs, that could actually be a ruse. That the threat might not be a real threat. It might just be a way to get the person in a state of terror. And when the person's in a state of terror, they've then got a better chance to bleed them of even energy than they could if the person was relaxed,
Yeah, and you also talk about in the book how there's, and you've talked about this in other places as well, how like the most mundane tasks, like eating, like they can't do. Like they'll go into a restaurant or something and order a steak and just look at it and just like pretend that they're just kind of like, well, the human.exe is not working there somehow,
Yeah. Funnily enough, I actually wrote about that today. And, for an article about steaks and Jello and the MIB. That'll be an article that should have been there too. But yeah, that's one of the weird things about the Men in Black. They seem to drain people of energy, which suggests they are sort of like a paranormal parasite, but physical, food as we see it, they just don't seem to understand it, or, it's just not something that they can digest. There are cases where people have sort of looked at food and liquid as if they'd never seen it before, that they had no idea what it was or even what it was for. There's some very, very strange cases like that where they just don't seem to have any kind of awareness of what they're supposed to do with it, or even what knives and forks are. Now, if that's true, and there are enough cases, for me at least, to say that this is a genuine part of that phenomenon, then that would arguably, give greater strength to the idea that they sort of are energy-based. They have to live on something, but for them it's energy. It's not something that's actually physical.
Right. Yeah. They don't actually eat as we understand it.
No, it's I guess the best way you could describe it would be, kind of plugging in your TV, or even better one, charging your iPhone, or your smartphone or whatever you've got. You plug the charger in, you attach your phone to it, and what happens? Well, the battery in your phone starts to go up from like 60% to 70%, and then it suddenly pings a bit later, and it's reached 100%. And that is a case of charging with energy a complex device. In this case, a phone. But you could make the same analogy that energy could be used to fuel a complex supernatural creature.
Yeah, you very well could. And a case in point that you use in this, and that's one of your, in the chapter on night visits, you talk about this lady named Allison that starts to have these night visits and get sick.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's one of the sort of more sinister aspects of this, where some people, have like one-off experiences where, they see something in the bedroom, they can't move, they're terrified, they wake up the next day feeling just wiped out. And then, okay, it was a bit traumatic, but it was a bad dream as they see it, and then they forget about it after a couple of days. But cases like the one you just mentioned about Alison, for example, there are some where the entities come back. Now, in the Men in Black cases and the Black-Eyed Children, usually people don't have repeated encounters with them. But there are some cases, like some of the ones I talk about in the book, where like supernatural things sort of manifest and appear in people's bedrooms, and they come back, and they come back again and again and again, night after night. And I talk in the book about several cases like this, where one case, a young girl, really did get sick. She dropped, I think something like 10 pounds or something like that over the course of about 2.5 weeks. And the family was very concerned, took her to the doctor, and she was a teenager. And the doctor, asked questions about bulimia and anorexia. And she said, I've got nothing like that. And I'm just losing weight. And, her skin started to change color, sort of just didn't look healthy, and kind of anemic and so on. And her mother got very, very concerned about this. And then she confided in her mother in something that she hadn't said before, because she would just thought, Mum would think she's lying or she was delusional, whatever. But saw this, this sort of dangerous entity appear, and that seemed to sort of bleed or drive her energy. And this kept going on. It ultimately came down to a friend of hers, of her mother, who knew quite a bit about sort of alternative health and things like this, and actually she did kind of like a cleansing of the house, and that actually brought it to a halt. And I actually spoke to Alison in person. This experience she had was like 20 years ago, and she's, she lives in Arizona now. She's got a nice life and put it all behind her. But she said that it was just like the worst time in her life. It was as if this thing was just coming back and like devouring her, night after night, and no one would listen.
Was she seeing? Was it kind of like an old hag experience, or was it kind of more like a shadow person kind of thing?
Well, I would actually say it was somewhere between the two, but sort of like a humanoid, predatory thing that sort of had the ability to materialize and dematerialize, but which also, when you saw it up and close, it kind of looked physical as well. So, there are some issues that we don't sort of fully understand, but she, 20 years or so after this experience, she still fully believes that this thing was there to sort of to feed on her, and was doing so in such a way that, had it not been brought to an end, she could have ended up, like someone who quite literally starved to death, that kind of situation.
Yeah, so these things can have a real physical effect. Something that I've noticed is that some people that have gone into like paranormal investigations and that some of those people will get sick, and they will have like some real serious health problems, and some people end up dying. So
there are some cases. You're right.
I don't know if that's something that maybe like you're going into areas where there's a lot of mold or some kind of like a pathogen, but it does seem like there's there's some weird stuff going on with that. People like you're putting too much energy into something and getting drained.
Yeah, I think there's also the possibility that whether deliberately or not, these things seem to give off some sort of energy that can have a very dangerous effect on us. I mean, I'm not talking about like radiation, but the parallels kind of there, in the sense that, if an atomic bomb explodes, a lot of people, they might think they're safe because they're in the house, but radiation seeps through the walls, the windows, the doors, etc. And before you know it, a week after, you're dying of radiation poisoning, which you can't see, you can't taste. It's like, you only know when you sort of puffing up blood, etc., etc. And I think it could be something like this, that these entities have some sort of an energy that they give off that can have an adverse effect on us in, drawing the parallel with how radiation can affect us. But, I've come across cases involving people who go out on, like, ghost investigations, haunted houses, and have seen something, and then a day or two after, they've been hospitalized with this or with that, as if like some sort of strange infection has occurred. In one of my books a couple of years ago, I talked about a guy who worked in a bar in Florida, and he told me how he encountered like a man in black and a woman in black, and they both looked really strange and weird, and
that was a creepy story.
Healthy, and he had an encounter with them, and he said it was clearly like he realized this was something supernatural, and then like 2 days later he went down with a really sort of rare infection, which the doctor was baffled as to how he'd even developed it in the first place.
Yeah, are you familiar with the story of the Dybbuk box?
The what, sorry?
The Dybbuk box, are you familiar with that story?
No, I'm not, no.
It's this story about this little wine box, a Jewish wine box, that a guy found in an antique store. Well, he bought it actually at a yard sale. And like the movie The Possession is based off of this. But this is supposedly a true story. How much credence you want to lend to some of it, but I think there's definitely a clear line of progression. There's lots of people that say, so he bought this box and it started having weird effects on his mother. His mother had a stroke. He was an antiques dealer, and he sold the thing on eBay, and he sold it to these college kids, and these college kids buy this thing, and they start having these symptoms of like basically radiation sickness, just as you described. Like their hair was falling out, their gums were bleeding, like all kinds of things were going on. And there was really nothing inside this box but just like a few little trinkets. I mean, there was nothing radioactive in this thing. So I've heard of that happening, and like there's something serious going on with that. Some kind of weird spiritual magic.
Did they ever put the Geiger counter to it?
I don't know if they did that, but so there's definitely a parallel there to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think whether it's deliberate, it may not even be deliberate sometimes on their part. It may just be, just us being in proximity to them has an effect on us,
Right.
And we only find out, when the person does get sick.
Could also depend on the person, like your own kind of body chemistry as well, how it affects you.
Yeah, and I think, that's another reason why to be wary of, people who sort of, carry out, programs and things like this to try and pull these things through, to call them through from their realms of existence to ours. You sort of, opening like a paranormal doorway. I always tell people that, well, if you look at a lot of supernatural experiences, it's easy to open a door. It's not quite so easy to close it behind you and push back whatever came through. And I think sometimes these things, whatever they are, they just have something built in them, if you like, which has a totally adverse, dangerous effect on us, whether they're feeding on us or not. They still affect us.
What are some of your personal speculations about the origin of the existence of entities like this and their parasitical relationship to us? Do you think there's something that have been here, since the beginning, or that at some point, in some primordial civilization, a gate was opened? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I'll tell you for why. Because, skeptics might say, well, this is like a new phenomenon, and, and just the men in black children. A lot of people don't realize that you can actually go way back to, the earliest years of human civilization, and when, writing started and things like that. For example, if you go back to ancient Babylonia, you had these supernatural entities, the incubus and the succubus. You had sort of male and female supernatural beings that people would wake up in the middle of the night and see either this sort of devilish-like woman or a man forcing the person to have sex with them. And one of the more sort of infamous examples of these sort of supernatural sexual entities is Lilith. Now, if you look at the ancient legends from like ancient Babylonia of Lilith and things like this, she again was like this predatory creature that would have sex with men in the middle of the night, and basically it was to steal their sperm, and then the story was that the sperm would be used to create her offspring, which were described as like these devilish children. And some researchers have suggested, well, maybe, this is just the black-eyed children today are the modern version, in terms of the name, of what people were seeing in ancient Babylonia, namely Lilith trying to conjure and create these sort of diabolical, devilish children of hers. So there's not really that much difference between, sort of like with alien abductions today. People are kidnapped, taken from their beds in the middle of the night. Eggs and sperm and DNA is taken from them, and then people talk about seeing these hybrid aliens. That sounds just like a modern version of Lilith and her, creepy kids. So yeah, I think you can make a very strong case that there's nothing new about this. And in the same way that legends developed back then, we have legends today. Some people believe in them, some don't believe in them. But I think there's enough data to suggest these phenomena are real. The problem is, in today's world where we think everything's just, straightforward and science can explain everything, they don't think about it. You had a bad dream, forget about it. But people don't realize the sheer scale of how this sort of paranormal parasitic activity goes on all the time, all around the world. But people just brush it aside,
And the Djinn also too, are another. They're another big part of like this kind of like, if we're talking about an origin story, this whole idea of the Djinn as being this, like there's the angels, there's mankind, and then there's the Djinn, and so the Djinn are almost kind of like you could really almost say that they're kind of more like equivalent in maybe Western society would be like the fairies.
Yeah, I mean the Djinn, for people who don't know, Djinn, it's a Middle Eastern term for a supernatural being. It's spelled D-J-I-N-N, but it's actually where the term genie comes from. like the TV show I Dream of Jeannie, the term genie actually comes not from her name, but from the Middle Eastern Djinn. Now, in essence, the Djinn are sort of energy-based entities, and there's some intriguing evidence that suggests they may be sort of like a plasma type of entity, and the excuse me, the sort of the leader, if you like, in the old texts of the Djinn was Iblis, and his name translated as despair. And he's basically sort of compared to Satan, the devil, in the Old Testament. And but the stories are very similar in the sense that there are if you look at a lot of biblical accounts, and also with the black-eyed children, it's as if they have to follow certain rules and regulations to allow them to do this or to do that. And the story of the Djinn and sort of their fall, so to speak, is actually quite very similar to, the Old Testament story of, the devil and heaven and hell and so forth. But according to the old legends, the Djinn themselves were supposedly born out of what was known or called smokeless fire. But as I said, that may have been sort of a distorted, simplistic term for what is basically called plasma. Plasma is basically like a hot ionized gas, which consists of positively charged ions and negatively charged electrons. And so one of the theories is that that's the form that the Djinn exist in. Now, according to the old legends, they can be friendly, they can be hostile, they can be manipulative, trickster-like, and but they essentially sort of feed on people in the same way that they require that energy that so many of these other entities do. But whereas a lot of these other entities just need the fuel or just want the fuel, the Djinn seem to enjoy playing sort of cruel tricks on people, to the point where sometimes it can actually be extremely dangerous, where people have reportedly just gone insane because of being, sort of tortured by these things. And so, you do have that other angle to it as well. I mean, there's actually quite a good, I think it's a really good movie that starred Denzel Washington about 15 years ago, and it's called Fallen, and he plays a police officer who's chasing down this, or he comes to realize it's like a demonic entity, and it actually, in the story, you can tell it's very much based on the legends of the Djinn, and so they are sort of said to be entities that don't screw with them at all. They're sort of perceived as the one more than any other, that if you cross paths with them, that they can make your life a complete living hell, and will do so just because sometimes they just want to do it.
Well, they seem like one of those things that stand out to Westerners, like references to them in the Quran and stuff, that it's probably some it is pre-Islamic Arabian folklore that was probably just so prevalent. There's no way Muhammad could leave them out. It was
one of the things that's fascinating about the Djinn, that has fascinated me, is that the Djinn could be good or they could be evil. I think mostly they're evil, but they could also be neutral too. And I've always found that a very fascinating concept. Again, that's just like the fairies in a way. Like you could really draw a real parallel between the two. I was happy to see that you quoted Joshua Cutchin's new book because Josh is a good friend of ours. So.
Oh, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
You're right with the Djinn. They're very kind of advanced and intricate and detailed in terms of their lives. I mean, we don't hear much about the lives of the black-eyed children or the men in black. You know, they just pop up out of nowhere and threaten people, and then they're gone. But with the Djinn, you know, they're described as being sort of highly advanced, intricate beings. According to the old legends, you know, they love music, particularly singing and whistling. And that actually is part of the story in the Denzel Washington movie, Fallen, where the supernatural thing jumps from person to person and is always singing. And so that's one of the interesting aspects. And so, you know, there's within the old legends, you know, the Quran and so on, of the Djinn, they are described as extremely sort of intricate things with families and lives much longer than ours. But at the end of the day, they are some sort of energy-based thing that's, you know, is in some way at least, you know, has a connection to the human race.
Yeah, isn't he singing like "Time Is on My Side," the Rolling Stones song?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Here's a couple that you don't think about in this context of energy parasites. This may be a little more physical, which is even more disturbing, actually. But Chupacabras and Bigfoot. Oh, well, let's talk about that.
Well, yeah, I debated whether to put the Bigfoot one in because it's not so much like a supernatural draining of energy, but there are some really weird and sinister stories where Bigfoot creatures may literally have sort of, you know, hunted down people in the woods and basically ate them. You know, I mean, there aren't, compared to the number of reports of Bigfoot that are on record of sightings, you know, the number of these sort of odd cases where people have vanished, you know, and or bodies have been found in sort of mutilated fashion. There aren't as many reports like that as there are sightings, but there are enough cases that lead me to think that, you know, that now and again people are in the woods and deep in the forests, and these creatures, you know, that perhaps there's been a bad winter, you know, and there's not much food, possibly they resort to, you know, taking out a person. And, you know, if you actually look at the figures every year of people who vanish, and interestingly enough, the number who vanish in United States national forests, you know, there's an intriguing story there. And David Paulides, he's done a lot of really good with his Missing 411 books. Now, David, to his credit, you know, he doesn't like to sort of speculate on this theory or that one. He, you know, has a background in the police, and so, you know, he applies that sort of approach of just going with the evidence and what we know for sure. And he's come up with some really weird cases of people who vanished under extremely odd circumstances. And, you know, so that idea that, you know, Bigfoot could be sort of, you know, these creatures could sort of hunt us down, is a very sort of disturbing one. And, of course, you think of these animals sort of 8 foot tall and 500 pounds. I mean, at the end of the day, none of us would stand up well in a fight against something like that. You know, you just would not stand a chance at all. But when it comes to the Chupacabra, that's a little bit different. I mean, I've been on a lot of expeditions to Puerto Rico looking for the Chupacabra. The first time I went was 2004. The latest time was just a couple of years ago, and I like Puerto Rico a lot, and I actually thought about moving there perhaps one day, because you know, I like the San Juan and the area and the culture and you know, the lifestyle and everything else. It's sort of a cool place, and you know, I've got to know a lot of people on the island who have done research into the Chupacabra and investigated cases like veterinarians, police officers, civil defense people, researchers of the paranormal, and there are a lot of different theories as to what the Chupacabra is or isn't. You know, you have the idea that it's some sort of alien angle, you know, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger Predator movie, you know, like it's like On the Hunt or something like that, you know. That's the one angle, the extraterrestrial angle. Then you've got the idea of some sort of like a giant bat or something like this, or something that survived from the Jurassic period, that kind of thing. But every time I've been to Puerto Rico, I've also heard of like supernatural theories that reportedly there are sort of occult groups on Puerto Rico that sort of use sort of magical rituals, occult rituals, to try and summon these things through from other portals and doorways from sort of multiple dimensions and bring them forth into our realm of existence. Now, in those cases, there's always been that angle as well, where the Chupacabra is sort of feeding supernaturally on the person who calls them through, or who they direct the Chupacabra to attach itself to.
I want to sick a Chupacabra on somebody. Go get him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's not quite, as simple as that, but it is more along the lines of, calling through this sort of ethereal, not necessarily fully physical thing, and then, and have it sort of, quite, well, I guess in a way, attack a certain person, but it's almost like a curse. But in these cases as well, people have said that they've seen these creatures, in these ceremonies that have been carried out to bring them through, and that some of the people taking part in the ceremonies, they fell sick as well. So again, there's that parallel with dabbling in the paranormal, bringing something through, and then people get ill.
Yeah, that was a very strange part of the book. I'd never even thought about that with the Chupacabra. Well,
I mean, I have to be honest, had it not been for the fact that, I have spent so much time on Puerto Rico,
yeah,
I wouldn't have known of it either, because most people think of, the creature as like I said, it's some sort of alien creature, or just an animal on the island that we don't know about, or some sort of genetic experiment. It was only when I sort of got the confidences of the people and chatted with them, and they realized, I wasn't going to sort of screw them over and anything like that. I just genuinely wanted to know. That's when I started to hear from more and more people of, hey, we don't talk about this much, but there are a lot of people who we can put you in touch with who, practice, sort of supernatural rites and so on. And then they sort of opened up more that, hey, this is what a lot of us think is the origin of the Chupacabra, this sort of ritualistic magic to bring things through from other forms of existence or realms of existence. And but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have heard that had I not sort of spent time there and, got to know the people as well. So.
Is this like Santeria? Is that what do they practice?
Yeah,
that?
Well, actually, funnily enough, I did an entire book on this called Chupacabra Road Trip a couple of years ago, and one of the guys actually told me that one of these groups was actually an offshoot of Santeria, which is one of their big religions, and which does actually involve like animal sacrifice and so on, and which was also a part of some of these other rituals performed to bring the Chupacabra through. So, we're not talking about traditional Santeria, but we're talking about offshoots and things like that. And one of the people told me about how this was undertaken at the home of a rich guy on Puerto Rico. And the way he described it, it was almost like the whole Eyes Wide Shut kind of scenario, in this big house, and everybody was wearing masks, and and then these rituals were performed. It was very similar to that.
Yeah, the Bigfoot. Now, are you going to with Bigfoot? Maybe that he is more of a. We're talking about more of like a not a physical creature, which I know that's becoming a bigger idea now. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I just thought, the Bigfoot was like the American equivalent of like an African gorilla, but we just hadn't found it and we weren't sure what it was.
Yeah.
Now, the vast majority of people who see Bigfoot do describe what is just like a large ape of some sort, but we don't know what it is. People see it running through the woods or walking through the woods, etc., etc. But there is a small body of reports, and it is admittedly, a small body compared to just the straightforward sightings. But there are cases where people claim to have seen Bigfoot quite literally vanish in front of them, or the creature will vanish in a flash of light. There are reports where people have seen the creature and it's surrounded by these weird little balls of light, or balls of light are above them in the woods, that kind of thing. Some really weird cases where people claim to have sort of had telepathic contact with these creatures, and a lot of really strange stuff like that. Now, of course, if you're dealing with a regular ape, well, things like that just don't happen. You don't have people out in Africa seeing a gorilla and then it just vanishes in front of them. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, right.
Never will. It never will, But in these cases, although it clearly seems to be like a physical component, there also seems to be almost like a supernatural component as well. So, I'm a firm believer in that the Bigfoot creatures do exist, but I'm not just fully convinced that they're just unknown apes. I think there's something about Bigfoot that it explains why it's so elusive, but I'm not sure what it is. It could be portals and doorways to other, dimensions, possibly. That's an interesting theory that a lot of people talk about, that Bigfoot isn't always in our reality, that it flits in and out of our reality. And that, that might explain why in a country like the US, we cannot catch even one 8-foot-tall, 400-pound creature, we should be able to get at least one. Because they've been reported.
Bag and tag, and they're out there hunting, so you'd think they get one.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, they've been reported in every state apart from Hawaii for obvious reasons, because it's an island. But just about every other state, there have been a lot of reports. We even got reports like from Nevada, in the desert, which is really strange. But, with 300 plus million people in the country,
right,
drive cars late at night through the woods, you would think by now we would have hit one or we'd have found a body, etc., etc. So I think possibly the overwhelming elusiveness of Bigfoot could just be because, for the most part, it's not in our reality, and perhaps we only really ever see it when it is in our reality,
Well, I've said it before, but, I've always thought, the western part of the United States, I'm more even though there's weird cases there, I'm more likely to believe that because you've got much more of a land area, and you've got, those forests are huge, and so something could hide out there. That's a possibility. But the further east you go, the more populated you get, and also the stories get weirder and weirder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a good example, a friend of mine, Stan Gordon, wrote a book called Silent Invasion a few years back, and that's all about a wave of Bigfoot activity in Pennsylvania in the early to mid-'70s. And Stan got some really weird stories where people had seen Bigfoot and they'd been visited by the Men in Black, or they'd seen strange light in the sky where Bigfoot was seen. It was like the lights were literally illuminating the creatures in the fields and the woods. And, cases like that sort of demonstrate to me, we're dealing with something that's beyond just an unknown ape. Now, I have a lot of good friends in the Bigfoot field who are absolutely 100% convinced that it is nothing but just an American ape, that we haven't classified it as to what it is. And maybe that is the answer, I don't know. But for me, these weirder aspects kind of really intrigue me, because arguably we shouldn't have any cases like that if it's just a normal animal. There shouldn't be any reports like that, but there actually are, more than a few of them.
Yeah, is that Chestnut Ridge, I think, is one of the main places of just total weirdness. Cannot let you go, Nick, without telling this story. This one, I have heard this one before, but this is the one about the soldiers in Vietnam that saw something very disturbing in a clearing.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, this is, again, one which falls not so much into like a supernatural category, but another example of how we might be being fed on literally like, as if Bigfoot's sort of, chasing us down. But this story came from the late Leonard Stringfield. Leonard Stringfield was a UFO researcher who lived in Ohio, and he started to get into the UFO subject in the early 50s, but he'd actually had his own encounter when he was in 1946, when he was in the U.S. military, and he saw this sort of this series of like strange balls of light, which was similar to what became known as the Foo Fighters in the Second World War, which, for people who don't know, that's where the band got their name from, these sort of strange balls of light flitting around the skies, and the Germans thought it was a secret weapon of us, and we thought it was a secret weapon of theirs, but that they saw these sort of strange balls of light flitting around. And Stringfield never forgot that experience, and so when the whole flying saucer phenomenon kicked off in 47, he started to take an interest and did a lot of research and wrote a number of good books on the subject. Now, like most authors, people contacted with their own accounts, and one of the ones that reached Stringfield was one that occurred at the height of the Vietnam War, and it involved a unit of U.S. personnel, sort of like highly trained, squads, assassination squads, that kind of thing, to take out North Vietnamese units, that kind of thing. They were reportedly walking through the forested areas, approaching one particular area where they were to take out a North Vietnamese team, and they saw this spherical object. It wasn't like a flying saucer. It was literally like a globe, like completely, circular, like a soccer ball. And what happened was that they sort of stumbled onto it, and they were sort of literally almost frozen to the spot. They were trained to take on North Vietnamese personnel. What they actually saw were these sort of about 5 foot tall, skinny, large-headed creatures that were reportedly taking human body parts into these large bins and throwing them in, and then sealing these bins, and then loading them on the craft, but from the underpart of the craft. And they said that Stringfield's source, bear in mind that Stringfield was actually a well-decorated member of the U.S. military, so he's someone who could be trusted, etc. And his source was like a high-ranking member of the military, and he said that they saw, according to the unit, they saw what looked like to be North Vietnamese people and white people and black people taken on board as well, which may have been, the white men and the black people could have been, U.S. troops, and of course the others were the North Vietnamese ones. And they were all reportedly, these body parts. They weren't bodies; they were body parts. Were being loaded into these bins, and then there was like a firefight where some of the troops were killed and one or two of the aliens were. Then reportedly they were debriefed by the CIA and then subjected to, or at least some of the team was subjected to, like mind-altering chemicals and so on, to try and make them forget what they actually saw. So this is like a really weird and creepy story, that sort of makes you wonder, how deep does this aspect of, us being used as a food source, how far does it really go,
Yeah, that reminds me, there's a lot of lore about creatures being at battle sites. We had a guest on, we were talking about local Civil War lore, about people seeing things feeding on the corpses on the battlefield.
The green eyes.
That's what that sounds like. Yeah, it's weird.
Well, again, you could make a case. What's more traumatic and,
Yeah. You got all these high energy things like sex, death, birth.
Most of us don't get, most people don't fight in a war. You get to see it on CNN or whatever, But I'm sure, if you're at the height of battle, it must be terrifying, guns flying around, your friends being killed. You could easily see how people's, energy levels and, sense of terror and fear, etc. I mean, it would just go through the roof, you know.
Yeah, I want to believe that story is apocryphal, because if that's true, that's like probably the most disturbing story I've ever heard.
Well, it is. And I mean, one thing, when I wrote it up, I mean, you know, I realised it is a controversial one, but I mean, I think the important thing to note is that, as I said, Stringfield was a decorated military officer, you know, and on top of that, he went on the record as saying that, you know, his source was someone who he'd come to know and was a high-ranking member of the military. And I don't see any reason for Stringfield to lie. You know, I mean, he was a well-respected UFO researcher,
Yeah.
as I said, with a you know, a good, solid military background.
I want to sleep tonight, Nick. Thank you.
Sorry, you might not.
Nick, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Yeah, great show, man.
Tell people where they can get the book and your other books. You said you think this is number 48, so.
Thereabouts. I'd have to count them, but I can't be bothered. No, I'm just joking. But yeah, it's round about coming up to 50. But the new one, Paranormal Parasites, you can get it off Amazon. It's also available on the shelves in Barnes & Noble. And all my books you can get on Amazon, and about 60% of them you can get off Barnes & Noble. And if people want to contact me, probably the best way is just fire me a Facebook message, and you know, I'm always happy to chat with people, and you know, if they got any questions about cases or they want some advice on something that's happened to them, you know, I'm always happy to take time, you know, to speak to people. And yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of Nick Redferns, surprisingly, on Facebook, but luckily, if you type my name in, I'm at the top, so it makes it easier, you know, to find me. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Nick. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out.
Okay.
And guys, we'll be right back to close out the show on Conspirinormal.
Live feed real time.
Yep, live feed real time. You got to blow your nose there, put some Vicks on, put out there working in the cold.
Yes. I've been drafted on Hoth for the Empire. It's a real pain in the ass.
You got any thoughts on that interview we just did? I always love having Nick on. He's one of my favorite guests. The guy is really, like, I mean, he's such a prolific author and also just such a wealth of information too. How he can memorize all that. I mean, the guy. I've had the privilege of meeting Nick in person. I mean, he is just like as you hear on the you know, he gets to good conversations with the guy. It's really, really cool. But I know you got some doubts on some of that stuff, like the paranormal parasite stuff.
I mean, I don't know the I don't know what I think. It's not that I'm you know, I mean, you know me, I'm not a total materialist at all.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is, and a lot of me thinks that a lot of this stuff is psychological, but my definition of what psychological is a lot more expansive. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I don't know if, like, as psychological phenomenon, if like it that we birth all these things. And that's to say also that thought forms, you know, can create, you know, we can create independent things that become out of our control. And, you know, my interest in a lot of, like, Eastern concepts, I think, have influenced me in that dimension also. So I'm just totally agnostic about it, really.
Yeah.
I think there's something to all this, but I don't have like any kind of faith that of what it is at all. It's just totally agnostic.
Yeah, I mentioned before about the Djinn, about the good, the evil, and the neutral, and that the fact that you could have that tradition, I think, is really interesting, because that's unlike some of the others where you have like this. There's either good angels, bad angels. There's nothing in between. Djinn are generally considered to be kind of like people, and in that way, they're kind of analogous to the fairies.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying, like a more Western civilization. So there's almost this like overlap there of just the same beings, but we're just calling them by different names depending on the culture. And I think we're beginning to find out that these entities, if they exist, and I know that's a big if, because honestly, some of this stuff is just by what you believe, and then also by what somebody experiences. Like, you can hear stories all day long, but if you don't experience it yourself, you might have a different viewpoint on it. But I do believe that these entities exist. So I find it fascinating that these things exist, and they exist under different names, and it's because of that people tend to get confused. But we're starting to kind of really figure out that these may all be the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
That I find really, really fascinating. And then the whole idea, like, Greg Bishop talks about the co-creation theory, about whether or not that is something that is, we are part of the equation, basically, to our interactions with these entities. So, yeah, I always loved it. This was one I've wanted to talk about for a while, is kind of like this whole idea, like paranormal parasites. And I know Ren Collier is also kind of into this whole idea.
Well, we've kind of riffed on this too, about kind of the Lovecraftian angle of this, and then that bleeds into the conspiracy world, and whether you have this current back to Gnosticism of the worldly powers and their interaction with the political and actual worldly powers, and it gets kind of weird, and no matter how much faith you have in it, when you see elements of things with the elites, and it's like kind of like, what is this about? Is this it feels like that type of thing. I'll just put it at that. Or at least the symbolism is intended to be, to state that this kind of relationship is going on, even if it's just this allegorical story or something abstract like that. Like, these types of themes are put out there. But yeah, it's weird. We've talked about that before, and
yeah, it all connects together in some kind of weird way.
Yeah,
but you can't quite put your finger on it. Interesting that you mentioned that, because we've talked about with Walter Bosley, who we're going to have come back on here in a future date pretty soon. But he's talked a lot about this whole, Hecate and Hecate worship. And one of those that is kind of analogous to Hecate, in my opinion, and his opinion, and others' opinion, is Santa Muerte. And this was interesting. Someone sent this to me that is a friend of the show. And this is something that happened in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is what Clarksville's maybe 30 miles from us?
Yeah, it's about an hour away, roughly. And it's the major military town of Tennessee.
Right, yeah. Fort Campbell was there. So there was... Well, I'll just read this article and kind of get your thoughts on this. Failed human sacrifice to Santa Muerte sends 2 to jail on attempted murder charges. Clarksville, Montgomery County Crime Stoppers Okay, hold on. 2 people have been arrested on attempted murder charges after a man said they stabbed him inside a Clarksville mobile home and told him they were going to sacrifice him to Santa Marta, the saint of the death, according to their arrest warrants. Santa Marta, a Mexican folk deity, is associated with protection and delivery to the afterlife. While condemned by the Catholic Church, a religion based on the figure has several million followers worldwide, the BBC reported last year. A third suspect was also accused but had not yet been arrested, although there is an active warrant for his arrest in Montgomery County. The stabbing happened December 26, 2017, but the man accused of starting the attack wasn't arrested until Tuesday when police were finally able to find him. Jose Raul Mendez told police he was inside a mobile home on Power Street when Bernardino Rodriguez Molina began crying. When he asked him why, Molina told him, "You are about to die."
Damn.
He said that he was going to sacrifice Mendez to Santa Marta. He ordered another man and woman to lock the doors and windows to keep him from escaping, according to his arrest warrant. The 2 complied, and Mendez said he ran to a bedroom, but was captured by the suspect, stabbed in the left forearm, struck in the head with a knife, and punched. Molina snatched his phone to prevent him from calling police. One of the 3 yelled for Molina to finish the job, but Mendez escaped through a window, according to the warrants. Mendez said the 3 got in a truck, yelling they were going to catch him, but he hid, and they drove past him. He then ran to another home and asked a man to call police. The trio spotted him at the man's front door, so he fled and hid at another mobile home until police arrived. Mendez was taken to Tenova Healthcare for a stab wound, swelling to his left eye, and bruising to his ribs, according to the warrant. Clarksville police searched the mobile home where Mendez was attacked and found Molina's ID and blood evidence. According to the warrant, the occupants were gone. Warrants were issued for their arrest February 23rd. Sarah Colleen Miller, 31, was arrested February 23rd and indicted on charges of attempted first-degree murder and especially aggravated kidnapping. On Tuesday, Molina, 41, was arrested on charges of attempted murder, especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated assault. There is an active warrant for the third person listed as taking part in the attack. Daniel Rodriguez Molina, Clarksville police spokesman Jim Knoll confirmed Thursday, but it has not been served and he remains at large. So, attempted sacrifice to Santa Marta, which I've got Sergio's candle to Santa Marta in my hand right now.
I don't know. It sounds like more like the saint of meth than the saint of death.
Well, it's funny because I've heard some things about Santa Marta, and I've never heard human sacrifice associated with
me neither, but
Santa Marta.
But I mean, how many rednecks have gotten, have tried to sacrifice people to the devil, or I mean, it's
listening to too many Judas Priest albums.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah, I just thought that was interesting since it's something in our local area.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's not too much of a trend.
Hey, people get sacrificed every day, B.
Don't sacrifice people to Santa Marta. All right, I think we're going to leave it there, guys. Next episode, we have Cisco Murdoch and Steve Stockton coming back, and they're going to talk about their new book, which is about Cisco's experiences, paranormal experiences, and also a little bit of Steve's. We did talk to them early last year in 2017, but we're gonna try to get some new ground and get some updates on things that are going on at both their lives. And you guys may have noticed, if you're listening regularly, that there's been a lack of Rob. He's not been around. We've been recording in Studio B now for this is the third straight episode. So hopefully he will be returning. He's been extremely, extremely busy. And we do want to say that we do miss him.
We miss you,
And
Rob.
we hope that he does return. But Sergio's been doing a fine job.
And I'm sitting here drinking scotch out of a bottle like Rob does.
Yeah, you're turning into him. You're turning into Rob. You need to grow your hair out a little bit longer.
It
Grow your beard a
doesn't. It
little
doesn't
longer.
grow as much as his. Yeah.
All right, well, we do want to say that we do miss him. So, also, guys, Patreon, that is still a going concern. So, if you guys want to support the show, we do have some Patreon episodes up, and we do have some ideas about some things that we can do that do not include talking our guests into doing Patreon.
And we're probably about to hit you with commercials, but they're gonna be cool Conspirinormal commercials.
Yeah. So we are struggling to get to about $100, guys. So get us back past that point. People do drop off, which is understandable. But it is www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal. You can also leave a one-time donation on the website, which is conspirinormal.com, and there is a button there for donate. So, any last thoughts or anything you want to say, Mr. Sergio?
No, that's a pretty cool show, man. That was great.
Yep. I've been looking at your I Spy magazine.
Yeah, I got some
night.
awesome total trash spy magazine from England.
Very strange stuff. There's a lot of obsession with Russia, which is a whole other story. So, all right. Thank you guys, and we will be back next week on Conspirinormal. Miss you, Rob.